Steam hissed from copper pots while ladles scraped against iron. The prison kitchen, alive with the frantic preparation of death. The acrid tang of lye soap mixed with roasting meat and something else, something metallic that shouldn't belong in any feast. This is the story of how one woman turned a celebration into a graveyard, with nothing more than kitchen access and a heart full of calculated rage. Celeste Thibodaux stood at the massive stove in the Orleans Parish Prison on the night of November 15, 1887, her calloused hands stirring wine reduction for the warden's anniversary banquet. The kitchen stretched before her like a ship's galley, all blackened cast iron and scarred wooden tables, while gas flames licked the air with blue tongues. 23 guests would arrive within the hour, including the mayor, 3 judges, and Louisiana's lieutenant governor. They'd come to celebrate Warden Marcus Beauregard's 10 years of iron-fisted rule over the South's most notorious prison. From her position beside the main stove, Celeste could see through the barred window into the prison yard where November rain turned dirt into soup. Gas lamps flickered against brick walls like dying stars, casting shadows that moved with the rhythm of pacing guards. The smell of wet limestone and human misery drifted through every crack in the building's foundation. She'd been cooking in this kitchen for 3 years, ever since Judge Morrison sentenced her to 15 years for allegedly stealing from her employer's house in the Garden District. The evidence had been planted, the trial a foregone conclusion, but Celeste had learned that justice and truth rarely occupied the same courtroom when your skin carried the wrong complexion. Tonight's menu featured her specialty: duck glazed with wine reduction, roasted vegetables in cream sauce, and individual chocolate soufflés that had made Warden Beauregard famous among New Orleans society. What the guests wouldn't know was that Celeste had been collecting rat poison for 6 months, storing small amounts in a hollowed-out brick behind the flour barrels. Arsenic was surprisingly easy to acquire in a prison. The building teemed with vermin, and poison was considered as essential as soap. A few grains here, a pinch there, accumulated over months of patient gathering. She tested doses on the prison cats first, noting how much it took, how long the symptoms lasted, adjusting her calculations with the precision of a chemist disguised as a cook. The kitchen door swung open with a metallic screech. Guard Captain Henri Thomas entered, his brass buttons catching lamplight as he surveyed the preparation. "Smells magnificent, Celeste. The warden's guests will be impressed." "Yes, sir," she replied, eyes downcast, hands continuing their steady work. "Everything will be perfect." Perfect was the word. She'd mixed the poison into the wine reduction simmering in the copper pot, stirred it into the cream sauce for the vegetables, even dusted it like sugar over the chocolate soufflés cooling on the windowsill. Every dish that would touch their lips carried death in its seasoning. But here's what the prison records don't reveal. Celeste wasn't working alone. Guard Samuel Broussard leaned against the doorframe, pretending to supervise while actually serving as lookout. 3 other prisoners moved through their kitchen duties with careful coordination, each playing their part in tonight's deadly choreography. The cook assigned to bread duty, Marie Laveau, had been smuggling messages between cells for months. The woman peeling potatoes, Anna Hebert, had distracted guards during crucial poison-gathering moments. They'd all lost something to this place. Marie's son had died in the prison infirmary when the doctor refused treatment, claiming resources were better spent on white inmates. Anna's sister had been beaten to death by guards for talking back. Each woman carried her own reasons for stirring tonight's deadly feast. The grandfather clock in the warden's office chimed 7 times, each note hanging in the humid Louisiana air like a funeral bell. The guests would arrive at 8. By 10, this kitchen would be the center of a mystery that would baffle investigators for decades. Before we go deeper into this dark chapter of American justice, tell me where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records for over a century. Guard Captain Tomas lifted a wooden spoon to taste the wine reduction, and Celeste's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. But the captain only nodded approval before leaving to prepare the dining room. He had no idea he'd just sealed his own fate with that single fatal taste. The kitchen fell silent, except for the hiss of gas flames and the distant sound of prisoners settling into their cells for the night. Celeste looked at her fellow conspirators, each woman's face a mask of calm determination. In 2 hours, the most powerful men in Louisiana would sit down to supper. By morning, Orleans Parish Prison would need a new warden. But what happens when the very people meant to guard justice become its victims, and the imprisoned become its instruments? Carriages rolled through the prison gates like funeral processions, their wheels splashing through puddles that reflected gas lamp light in fractured golden shards. The clip-clop of horses' hooves on wet cobblestone announced the arrival of Louisiana's elite, stepping down from their conveyances into a trap they couldn't yet smell. These weren't just dinner guests. They were the architects of a system that ground human lives into profit margins and called it civilization. Warden Marcus Beauregard stood in the prison's main foyer at exactly 8:15, his silver pocket watch catching the light as he greeted each arrival with practiced charm. The foyer smelled of fresh wax and fear sweat that no amount of polish could quite eliminate, while the distant echo of cell doors and shuffling chains provided an unsettling soundtrack to the evening's festivities. Mayor Philippe Tremé arrived first, his rotund figure squeezed into formal evening wear that strained at every seam. Behind him came Judge Morrison, the same man who'd sentenced Celeste to 15 years on fabricated evidence. District Attorney Charles Maraggi followed, notorious for his prosecution of freed slaves on trumped-up charges that kept the prison's labor force well-stocked. In the kitchen, Celeste watched through the service window as these men shook hands and shared cigars, their laughter echoing off limestone walls. Each face belonged to someone who'd profited from her imprisonment, from the systematic brutalization of anyone who couldn't afford proper representation. The dining room had been transformed for the occasion. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across mahogany panels, while fresh magnolia blossoms' ironic choice adorned each table setting. The finest china from the warden's personal collection gleamed under candlelight, soon to be stained with more than wine. From the Orleans Parish Prison Visitor Log, November 15, 1887. Evening reception for civic leaders. Menu prepared by prisoner workforce under supervision. All dietary precautions observed. Lieutenant Governor Auguste Boudreau made his entrance with theatrical flair, his silver-tipped cane tapping against marble floors. He'd built his political career on promises of prison reform while quietly investing in companies that supplied cheap convict labor to sugar plantations across Louisiana. Guard Captain Tomas began seating guests according to a carefully planned arrangement. The warden had positioned himself at the head table, surrounded by the most influential attendees. What he didn't know was that Celeste had studied this seating chart for weeks, calculating exactly how the poison would spread through the room, based on who would share dishes and pass serving platters. The irony was exquisite. These men who'd spent careers deciding the fates of others would have their own fates decided by the very woman they'd condemned to cage. At 8:45, the first course emerged from the kitchen. Celeste herself carried the wine reduction, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to unleash. Guard Samuel Broussard flanked her, maintaining the pretense of security while actually ensuring no last-minute interference could stop the plan. Judge Morrison raised his glass for the first toast. To Warden Beauregard, who has shown us that proper discipline can transform even the most hopeless criminals into productive members of society. The assembled men drank deeply, unaware they were swallowing their own judgment. Conversation flowed with the casual cruelty of men accustomed to power. Mayor Tremé regaled the table with stories of recent arrests, describing human beings as if they were livestock to be processed. District Attorney Maraggi, boasted about conviction rates that had tripled since he'd taken office, never mentioning the falsified evidence, and bought witnesses that made such numbers possible. But something else was happening in the room's shadows. The handful of trusted prisoners serving as waitstaff moved with unusual precision, their eyes meeting in silent communication. Marie Laveau refilled water glasses while listening to every word, memorizing names and faces for future reference. Anna Hebert cleared plates with methodical care, noting which guests had consumed the most poison-laced food. The system was eating itself alive. By 9:15, subtle changes began manifesting. Judge Morrison loosened his collar, complaining about the room's temperature. Lieutenant Governor Boudreau's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his wine glass. Mayor Treme paused mid-sentence, his face flushing an unnatural shade of red. Still, the dinner continued. These were men accustomed to discomfort, to pushing through weakness in pursuit of their goals. They attributed their symptoms to rich food and strong drink, never suspecting that their host's kitchen had become a laboratory of revenge. Warden Beauregard stood to deliver his anniversary speech, his voice already beginning to slur, though he attributed it to celebration. "Gentlemen, we have built something remarkable here. A place where society's failures can be transformed into assets, where the worthless can finally serve their betters." In the kitchen, Celeste cleaned the last traces of arsenic from her hands with lye soap, watching the water swirl down the drain, like evidence disappearing into history. What kind of justice comes from the kitchen of the condemned? And how long can 23 powerful men ignore the taste of their own cruelty? The grandfather clock chimed 9:30, and the chocolate soufflés were ready to serve. Silver spoons clinked against china, like tiny funeral bells, as dessert arrived. Each chocolate soufflé crowned with powdered sugar that disguised a more sinister seasoning. The dining room's air hung thick with cigar smoke and the metallic scent that comes just before lightning strikes. 23 of Louisiana's most powerful men were about to discover that justice, like poison, works slowly at first, then all at once. Celeste emerged from the kitchen carrying the final course on a silver tray, her face a mask of practiced servility. Behind her, Marie Laveau and Anna Hebert followed with coffee service, their movements synchronized like dancers in a ballet choreographed by vengeance. The grandfather clock in the corner showed 9:45, its steady tick marking time until revelation. The soufflé looked perfect dark chocolate peaks, dusted with what appeared to be confectioner's sugar, but contained enough arsenic to stop a horse's heart. Celeste had calculated the dosage with scientific precision, accounting for body weight, alcohol consumption, and the cumulative effect of poison already coursing through their systems from the earlier courses. Judge Morrison was the first to take a bite, his fork sliding through chocolate as smooth as silk. "Magnificent work, Beauregard. Your kitchen staff has outdone themselves." He had no idea he was praising the architect of his own destruction. From the kitchen doorway, guard Samuel Broussard watched with careful eyes. Most people assumed his loyalty lay with the warden who employed him, but Samuel had seen too much cruelty to ignore. His own brother had died in this prison, after guards broke his ribs during a routine inspection. Tonight, Samuel would ensure no interference, disrupted Celeste's carefully orchestrated finale. The irony was biblical in its proportions. These men who'd built careers on the suffering of others were being served their comeuppance one spoonful at a time by the very people they'd deemed worthless. Lieutenant Governor Boudreau loosened his tie, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool November evening. "Is it warm in here, or is it just me?" His voice carried the first hint of the panic that would soon consume them all. Mayor Treme nodded agreement, his usually steady hands beginning to shake as he reached for his wine glass. The crimson liquid sloshed like blood against crystal, reflecting candlelight in patterns that seemed to dance with malevolent life. District Attorney Marayi attempted to continue his story about a recent conviction, a freed slave he'd sent to prison for allegedly stealing bread, but his words began slurring together like wet paint. The assembled guests attributed these symptoms to celebration and strong drink, never suspecting their host's kitchen had become a chamber of execution. At exactly 10 o'clock, the first victim collapsed. Judge Morrison's fork clattered against his plate as his body seized, chocolate soufflé spilling across white tablecloth like a terrible communion. His eyes rolled back, revealing only whites that caught the gaslight with sickening clarity. The sound that emerged from his throat was neither word nor scream, but something between the voice of a man discovering that power provides no protection against chemistry. The room erupted into chaos, orchestrated by arsenic. Lieutenant Governor Boudreaux tried to stand, only to crash into his chair as his legs buckled. Mayor Tremay clawed at his throat, his face flushing purple, while foam gathered at the corners of his mouth like sea spray on a poisoned shore. Some truths can only be served cold. Warden Beauregard managed to ring the silver bell used to summon servants, its clear note cutting through screams and retching like a funeral dirge. But the staff who should have rushed to help moved with deliberate slowness, if they moved at all. In the kitchen, 3 prisoners heard the bell perfectly and continued washing dishes as if nothing had happened. District Attorney Marigny, even as his vision blurred and his stomach burned like molten metal, had enough clarity left to understand what was happening. Poison, he gasped, pointing an accusatory finger toward the kitchen. The food. We've been poisoned. All eyes turned toward the service entrance, where Celeste had been standing moments before. But she had already disappeared, melting into the prison's maze of corridors with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent 3 years learning every shadow, every blind spot, every guard's routine. The kitchen door stood empty, swinging slightly on its hinges like a mouth preparing to speak truths that would shake Louisiana to its foundations. In the chaos, no one noticed guard Samuel Broussard slip away from his post, or the way certain locks that should have been secure suddenly required no keys. The same system that had imprisoned Celeste was now facilitating her escape, corrupted from within by its own cruelty. What happens when the watchers become the watched and the judged become the judges? By 10:15, 12 of the 23 guests lay unconscious or worse, while the survivors crawled across Persian rugs that cost more than most prisoners would see in 10 lifetimes. The prison's alarm bell shattered the November night like glass against stone, its bronze voice screaming across New Orleans, while 23 of Louisiana's elite writhed in their own poison juices. Steam rose from manholes in the rain-slicked streets beyond the walls, carrying whispers of scandal that would topple governments and rewrite history. This wasn't just mass murder. It was the systematic dismantling of power by someone the system had deemed powerless. Dr. Alphonse Bienville arrived at Orleans Parish Prison at 10:37, his medical bag clutched in hands that had seen every manner of death except this. The carriage ride through the French Quarter had been a nightmare of urgency, horses' hooves striking cobblestones while gas lamps flickered like dying stars. He'd been summoned with a single word: poison. Inside the dining room, chaos reigned with scientific precision. 12 men lay unconscious or dead, their bodies arranged around the mahogany table like fallen dominoes in a game orchestrated by fate. The surviving 11 guests huddled against the walls, their faces masks of terror and disbelief. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows that made the living appear to move even when they'd gone still. Dr. Bienville moved from body to body with methodical horror, noting the cherry-red flush of skin, the contracted pupils, the foam dried at mouth corners. His preliminary assessment sent ice through his veins. Arsenic poisoning, administered in quantities that suggested not impulse, but calculation. "Who prepared the meal?" he asked Guard Captain Tomas, though the answer hung in the air like incense at a funeral. "The prisoner Celeste Thibodaux," Tomas replied, his voice hollow with realization. "She's been cooking for the warden's table for 3 years. 3 years of patience, 3 years of planning, 3 years of serving meals while calculating the perfect moment to serve justice instead. But here's what the initial investigation missed. Celeste hadn't simply vanished. She'd executed an escape plan that had been 3 months in the making, with assistance from sources that would shock investigators for decades to come. Guard Samuel Broussard stood in the prison yard, ostensibly organizing search parties while actually misdirecting them away from the kitchen's delivery entrance. His brother's death in this prison had cost him his faith in the system he'd sworn to protect. Tonight, he'd chosen a different kind of loyalty. The kitchen delivery gate swung open on hinges that had been deliberately oiled to prevent squeaking. Beyond lay a maze of service alleys that connected to the French Quarter's underground network of abolitionists, freed slaves, and sympathizers who understood that sometimes justice required stepping outside the law. From the New Orleans Daily Crescent, November 16, 1887. Unprecedented prison break follows mass poisoning. Entire civic leadership struck down during anniversary celebration. Negro cook sought for questioning. What the newspaper didn't report was the systematic way evidence had been destroyed. The copper pot that held the poisoned wine reduction had been scrubbed clean with lye strong enough to strip paint. The hollow brick where arsenic had been stored showed no trace of its deadly contents. Even the rats that should have died from Celeste's preliminary testing had been carefully disposed of in the prison's incinerator. Meanwhile, in a safe house, 3 blocks from the prison, Celeste sat in a rocking chair, while an elderly woman named Tante Marie cut her hair with scissors that caught lamplight like silver knives. The transformation was surgical in its precision, removing not just hair, but identity itself. 23 men, Tante Marie whispered, her voice carrying equal parts horror and admiration. You served them all, their judgment in one sitting. Celeste said nothing, her eyes fixed on the window where gas lamps flickered like souls escaping purgatory. The weight of what she'd done settled across her shoulders like a mantle woven from necessity and rage. She'd become something between avenging angel and calculating demon, shaped by a system that had given her no other choice. Back at the prison, the manhunt intensified with every passing hour. Sheriff Paul Theroux arrived with 24 deputies, their lanterns casting wild shadows across brick walls, while bloodhounds strained against leather leashes. The dogs had been given clothing from Celeste's cell, but the scent trail ended abruptly at the kitchen delivery gate, as if she'd simply evaporated into the humid Louisiana air. The truth was more methodical. Celeste had spent months studying guard rotations, memorizing the prison's layout, identifying sympathizers among both prisoners and staff. She'd learned which guards could be bought, which ones nursed grievances against the warden, which prisoners had connections beyond the walls. Revenge is a dish best served with careful planning. Dr. Bienville continued his grim work, documenting symptoms that painted a picture of scientific murder. The amount of arsenic required suggested access to significant quantities over time. Yet searches of the kitchen revealed only standard rat poison in expected amounts. Whoever had orchestrated this massacre had covered their tracks with the thoroughness of someone who understood that getting caught would mean a lynching rather than a trial. At midnight, a peculiar discovery emerged from the prison's administrative offices. The personnel file for Celeste Thibodaux was missing, along with records of her original arrest and sentencing. Someone had systematically removed evidence of her existence from official documentation, leaving investigators with a ghost who'd killed 23 men and vanished without a trace. How do you hunt someone who was already invisible to the system that created her? And what happens when the hunted becomes the hunter? 3 miles away, in a boarding house that didn't appear on any official maps, Celeste examined her reflection in a cracked mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Dawn broke over New Orleans like a fever dream, painting the Mississippi River the color of dried blood, while fog rolled off the water, carrying whispers of scandal that would reshape Louisiana politics forever. Church bells tolled 6 times across the French Quarter, each bronze note a funeral dirge for the old order. The manhunt for Celeste Thibodaux had become the largest in Louisiana history, with rewards that could buy a plantation and enough manpower to siege a city. Sheriff Thibodaux stood in the prison kitchen at sunrise, his weathered face grim as stone, while he examined evidence that told him everything and nothing. The copper pots gleamed like mirrors, scrubbed so clean they reflected his frustration back at him. Not a grain of arsenic remained, not a fingerprint, not even the faintest residue that might provide a clue to how 23 men had been systematically poisoned. His bloodhounds circled the kitchen delivery gate for the 100th time, their noses pressed to cobblestones that had been washed with lye strong enough to strip paint. The scent trail ended as abruptly as a prayer cut short, leaving the dogs whimpering in confusion while their handlers cursed the November rain that had washed away evidence like tears. But 6 blocks away, in a basement that didn't appear on any city map, Celeste sat perfectly still while Tante Marie applied walnut oil to her skin and hands. The transformation was more than cosmetic, it was resurrection. The woman who'd entered this safe house as prisoner number 473 was emerging as someone entirely new. Marie Boudreau, Tante Marie announced, holding up forged papers that bore official seals and signatures copied with artisan precision. Free woman of color, seamstress by trade, traveling to Mobile to care for her sick aunt. The irony of the surname wasn't lost on either woman. Lieutenant Governor Auguste Boudreau lay in St. Louis Cathedral's cemetery, his funeral scheduled for the following afternoon. Celeste would carry his name north like a trophy, a reminder of justice served at exactly the right temperature. From the New Orleans Daily Picayune, November 17th, 1887. Death toll rises to 16. Governor declares martial law in French Quarter. All Negro movement restricted until poisoner captured. What the newspaper couldn't report was the systematic way the underground network had been activated. Messages passed between church congregations, safe houses, and sympathetic whites who understood that sometimes justice required breaking unjust laws. The same routes that had smuggled escaped slaves north for decades now carried a different kind of refugee, a woman who'd committed the ultimate act of resistance. Father Auguste Moreau met them at the back door of St. Augustine's Church at exactly 7:15, his cassock rustling like autumn leaves while gas lamps flickered in the pre-dawn darkness. The priest had been harboring runaways for 20 years, hiding them in the church's crypts where the living and dead coexisted in Catholic shadows. "The riverboat leaves at 9, he whispered, pressing a rosary into Celeste's transformed hands. "Captain Broussard owes me favors dating to the war. He won't ask questions about an extra passenger." Captain Jacques Broussard was Guard Samuel's uncle, bound by family loyalty that ran deeper than law. The Mississippi Queen would carry Celeste upstream toward Memphis, just another free woman of color seeking better opportunities in a world that offered precious few. Death travels lighter than life, but the investigation was closing gaps with methodical precision. Dr. Bienville had discovered something others missed. The arsenic hadn't come from standard rat poison. Chemical analysis revealed traces of impurities that suggested a specific source, likely from industrial mining operations upriver. Only someone with connections beyond the prison walls could have acquired such quantities. Sheriff Thibodaux ordered raids on every boarding house, church, and safe house in the French Quarter. His deputies kicked down doors with the enthusiasm of men who understood their careers depended on catching the woman who'd humiliated Louisiana's entire power structure. They found hidden rooms, false walls, evidence of underground railroad activity, but no trace of Celeste Thibodaux. At 8:30, Marie Boudreau walked up the gangplank of the Mississippi Queen carrying a small carpet bag and the quiet dignity of someone born free. Her transformation was complete. Lighter skin from careful application of powders, different posture, even a slight limp suggested by a pebble placed strategically in her left shoe. The ticketmaster barely glanced at her papers, distracted by the chaos of departure preparations. Captain Broussard welcomed her aboard with practiced indifference, showing her to a cabin in the colored section while maintaining the careful distance that protected them both. The riverboat's paddle wheel began churning brown water into foam, carrying secrets upstream like prayers seeking heaven. In the distance, church bells began tolling for the dead, their bronze voices echoing across a city that would never feel safe again. 16 of Louisiana's most powerful men lay in morgues, victims of justice served one spoonful at a time by someone they deemed beneath notice. But as the Mississippi Queen steamed north through waters that had carried countless escaped slaves to freedom, Celeste stood at the stern, watching New Orleans disappear into morning mist. She'd taken more than lives. She'd taken the illusion that power provided protection from consequences. How far can you run when every lawman in the South wants your blood? And what happens when the Underground Railroad's final passenger carries death instead of seeking freedom? 300 miles upriver, federal marshals were already boarding northbound vessels, following a trail that led toward the one place Celeste could never truly hide. Federal marshals boarded the Mississippi Queen at Vicksburg like hunting hounds following a blood trail, their boots thundering across wooden decks while the paddle wheel churned muddy water into foam. The scent of coal smoke and desperation hung in the air thick enough to taste, while passengers whispered prayers in languages that predated American law. The woman who'd poisoned 16 of Louisiana's elite was 3 days ahead of justice. But justice had horses, telegraphs, and the entire weight of federal authority pressing north like a storm front. Marshal William Dubois stood in the captain's quarters at exactly 2:15 on November 20th, 1887, his weathered face studying passenger manifests with the intensity of a man reading scripture. Behind him, 3 deputies examined luggage with methodical thoroughness, searching for anything that might connect to the Orleans Parish Prison massacre. Marie Boudreau, Captain Jacques Broussard said, his voice steady despite the lies coating his tongue like river silt. Free woman of color, traveling to Memphis for family business, paid her fare in advance, kept to herself mostly. The marshal's eyes narrowed. Every instinct screamed that this steamboat captain knew more than he was revealing, but proving it would require evidence that had been carefully scrubbed away like blood from a butcher's apron. 200 miles ahead, Celeste had already disembarked at Memphis, melting into the city's vibrant community of freed slaves and abolitionists who understood that sometimes survival required collective silence. The riverfront smelled of cotton, tobacco, and secrets fermenting in the Tennessee heat, while church bells counted hours like a funeral dirge. She'd traded the identity of Marie Boudreau for something even more invisible. Sarah Coleman, washerwoman seeking employment in the industrial mills, sprouting like mushrooms across the Ohio Valley. The transformation was surgical different clothes, altered posture, even a slight accent borrowed from Georgia women she'd known in prison. But federal investigators were discovering patterns that pointed north, like compass needles, toward truth. From the Memphis Daily Appeal, November 21st, 1887. Mysterious woman sought in connection with Louisiana poisonings. Reward increased to $5,000. Armed and extremely dangerous. What the newspaper couldn't report was the systematic way evidence had been planted to misdirect the investigation. Dr. Bienville's chemical analysis of the arsenic had revealed something that made Sheriff Thibodaux's blood run cold. The poison hadn't come from Louisiana at all. Traces of specific minerals suggested mining operations in Colorado Territory, accessible only through complex supply chains that required connections far beyond any imprisoned cook. Celeste hadn't been working alone. She'd been part of a network. The revelation sent shockwaves through Southern law enforcement. If a prisoner could orchestrate mass murder with outside assistance, then no prison was secure, no authority figure safe. The very foundations of the justice system had been corrupted from within by people who understood its weaknesses better than its architects. In a boarding house outside Nashville, Celeste sat by a window overlooking railroad tracks that carried freight and freedom in equal measure. Her hands, once steady enough to calculate poison dosages, now trembled slightly as she sewed buttons onto factory uniforms. the weight of 16 deaths pressed against her conscience like lead blankets. But she'd made peace with necessity long ago. Tante Marie's network had prepared for this moment. Safe houses dotted the route north, like stars guiding escaped slaves toward Canada. Each stop coordinated with telegraph precision. The Underground Railroad's final passenger would reach freedom or die trying, carrying secrets that could topple governments if revealed. Marshal Dubois discovered the truth about Captain Broussard's family connections on November 22nd, tracing blood relations that linked him to guard Samuel Broussard at Orleans Parish Prison. The revelation came through War Department records. Both men had served in the same Union regiment, bound by loyalties that transcended law. The conspiracy stretched deeper than anyone had imagined. Federal agents raided the captain's cabin at midnight, finding hidden compartments that had smuggled dozens of escaped slaves to freedom over 2 decades. Among the evidence, forged papers bearing the name Marie Boudreau, along with detailed maps of Underground Railroad stations stretching from New Orleans to the Canadian border. Some secrets dissolve in river water, but the most damning discovery came wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath loose floorboards. A journal written in Celeste's distinctive handwriting, detailing not just the prison poisoning, but years of careful planning, network building, and systematic revenge against a justice system that had failed everyone who couldn't afford its protection. The journal revealed names, dates, connections, a web of resistance that included guards, prisoners, freed slaves, sympathetic whites, even government officials who'd grown sick of watching injustice masquerade as law. Celeste had been the catalyst, but the explosion had been building for decades. Marshal Dubois read passages that chilled him to the bone. Detailed studies of poison preparation, psychological profiles of intended victims, even backup plans if the primary massacre failed. This wasn't impulse or madness. It was warfare conducted with scientific precision by someone who understood that violence was the only language power would recognize. In Nashville, telegraph wires hummed with descriptions that made Celeste's skin crawl with recognition. Her carefully constructed identities were crumbling like sandcastles before incoming tide, each revelation narrowing the space between freedom and capture. How do you disappear when your face is on wanted posters from New Orleans to Chicago? And what happens when the Underground Railroad's most dangerous passenger reaches the end of the line? 50 miles north, federal agents were already waiting at the Cincinnati train station, following a trail that led toward the one place Celeste had always planned to make her final stand. Cincinnati's Union Terminal rose from morning fog like a cathedral built for iron horses, its arched windows catching dawn light, while steam hissed between platform gaps like souls escaping purgatory. The screech of brakes and clatter of wheels provided percussion for the Manhunt's final movement, while tobacco smoke and coal dust hung in the air thick enough to taste. The most wanted woman in America stood 20 yards from capture, disguised as just another washerwoman, heading north to find work in Ohio's growing industrial cities. Federal Marshal William Dubois stepped off the 7:45 train from Louisville at exactly 8:17 on November 25, 1887, his weathered face scanning the crowd with predatory intensity. Behind him, 6 deputies spread through the terminal like blood through water, each man carrying descriptions burned into memory and rewards that could buy small farms. They'd received a telegraph the previous evening. Sarah Coleman spotted boarding northbound freight. Matches description perfectly. Armed response authorized. What they didn't know was that Celeste had been watching their approach from the colored waiting area, her hands folded over a carpet bag that contained everything she owned in this world: forged papers, stolen money, and a small vial of poison saved for emergencies. The same substance that had killed 16 of Louisiana's elite now offered her a final choice between freedom and capture. The terminal's main hall stretched before her like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Gas lamps flickered against limestone walls while passengers hurried between trains. their footsteps echoing like gavels striking justice. She'd made it further than anyone thought possible. But every journey ends somewhere. From the Cincinnati Enquirer, November 26, 1887, manhunt intensifies at Union Terminal. Federal agents coordinate with local authorities. All northbound travel suspended pending investigation. But the newspaper couldn't capture what happened next. The systematic way, an entire community chose silence over cooperation with authorities they'd learned not to trust. Porter Isaiah Washington recognized Celeste. Despite her disguise, the careful way she held her left shoulder, favoring an old injury from her prison days. Instead of alerting authorities, he quietly directed her toward the freight loading area where sympathetic railroad workers had been hiding escaped slaves for decades. The Underground Railroad's final station was a maintenance shed behind the terminal, where the smell of grease and determination mingled with whispered prayers. 3 other fugitives waited in the shadows: a man fleeing debt bondage, a woman escaping an abusive marriage, and a teenage boy whose only crime was being born the wrong color in the wrong place. "Canada train leaves at midnight," Isaiah whispered, his voice barely audible above the hiss of distant locomotives. "But you'll have to make it through the day without being seen." 12 hours between freedom and the gallows. Marshal Dubois had begun systematic searches of every train car, luggage room, and hiding place in the terminal. His men questioned passengers with the thoroughness of inquisitors, comparing faces to wanted posters, while Cincinnati's underground network watched and waited for opportunities to misdirect the hunt. But federal investigators had learned from previous failures. This time, they'd brought bloodhounds from Louisiana animals that had been given clothing from Celeste's prison cell, carrying her scent across 5 states like an invisible chain binding hunter to prey. The dogs arrived at 10:30, their noses immediately picking up traces that made them strain against leather leashes with desperate enthusiasm. The scent trail led directly toward the freight loading area, where Isaiah Washington suddenly found urgent repairs that required his immediate attention far from any hiding fugitives. Some loyalties run deeper than law. Dr. Marcus Webb had joined the manhunt as a consulting expert, his knowledge of poison preparation making him invaluable for identifying their quarry. He'd studied Celeste's methods until he could think like her, predict her choices, understand the scientific mind that had turned a prison kitchen into a laboratory of revenge. "She'll have kept some poison," he told Dubois as they approached the maintenance shed. "Not for killing others for herself. She'd rather die free than live enslaved." The words proved prophetic. When federal agents surrounded the shed at 11:45, they found evidence of recent occupation, but no fugitives. 4 sets of footprints led toward the railroad tracks, where a northbound freight train had departed just minutes before. But one set of prints stopped at the shed's back door, beside a small glass vial that had been deliberately placed where investigators would find it. The vial was empty, its contents consumed by someone who'd chosen their own ending, rather than surrender to a system that had never offered justice. The final irony was written in the dust beside the vial, a message scratched with careful fingers that read, "Some chains break only when you're willing to become free." Was this suicide or the ultimate escape? And what happens when the hunted finally reaches the end of the line? The northbound freight disappeared into morning mist, carrying secrets that would reshape American understanding of resistance, justice, and the price of freedom. The empty vial caught morning light, like a diamond carved from desperation, its glass surface reflecting the faces of federal marshals who chased shadows across 5 states only to find death had claimed their quarry first. The scent of coal smoke and finality hung in the Cincinnati air, while bloodhounds whimpered in confusion, their noses pressed to earth that told stories no human could read. The most wanted woman in America had vanished into legend, leaving behind only questions that would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. Dr. Marcus Webb knelt beside the vial at exactly 11:58 on November 25, 1887. his medical training warring with instincts that screamed, this scene was too perfect, too convenient. The glass container bore no fingerprints, no residue, nothing but the faint scent of almonds that suggested cyanide rather than arsenic. A different poison entirely. She planned this, he murmured to Marshal Dubois, his voice carrying equal parts admiration and horror. Even her death was calculated. But was it death at all? Or the ultimate misdirection from a woman who'd spent 3 years learning that survival required becoming invisible? The manhunt officially ended at noon, when sheriff's deputies found what appeared to be a woman's body floating in the Ohio River, 2 miles downstream from the terminal. The corpse bore the right height, approximate age, and clothing that matched witness descriptions. Decomposition from cold water made positive identification impossible, but authorities declared the case closed with bureaucratic relief. From the Cincinnati Enquirer, November 27, 1887, Louisiana poisoner found dead in Ohio River. Manhunt concluded. Federal resources redirected to other investigations. What the newspaper couldn't report was the systematic way evidence had been manipulated. The body pulled from the river belonged to an elderly washerwoman who died of natural causes 3 days earlier. Her corpse dressed in Celeste's stolen clothes and weighted with stones to sink at precisely the right location. Meanwhile, 300 miles north, a woman calling herself Ruth Freeman stepped off a freight train in Detroit, carrying papers that identified her as a seamstress from Kentucky, seeking employment in Michigan's growing automotive industry. She moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible, her hands steady despite the weight of 16 deaths that followed her like shadows. The Underground Railroad had orchestrated its most elaborate deception, saving its final passenger through collective silence and strategic misdirection. Celeste Thibodaux was officially dead, but someone very much like her had been born in the space between justice and vengeance. Dr. Webb spent months analyzing the Cincinnati evidence, his scientific mind picking apart details that didn't align with suicide. The poison vial contained traces of cyanide, but chemical analysis revealed it had never actually held lethal quantities. The message scratched in the dirt showed signs of deliberate staging. Most damning, the supposed victim had left no actual body, only the convenient discovery of an unidentifiable corpse. His private conclusion, shared with no one, Celeste had faked her death with the same precision she'd used to poison 16 men. But federal authorities wanted closure more than truth. The case had embarrassed everyone from local sheriffs to federal marshals, exposing corruption and incompetence that reached the highest levels of government. Declaring the poisoner dead allowed damaged reputations to heal and uncomfortable questions to fade into bureaucratic amnesia. The impact rippled through Southern society like cracks in a foundation. Plantation owners and civic leaders suddenly found themselves questioning every cook, every servant, every face they'd learned to ignore. Kitchen staffs were dismissed wholesale, replaced by white workers who commanded higher wages but offered the illusion of safety. Some truths poison everything they touch. Orleans Parish Prison instituted new security measures that transformed it from a place of profitable brutality into something approaching actual rehabilitation. Warden replacements focused on reform rather than revenge, understanding that creating monsters inevitably led to monstrous consequences. Guard Samuel Broussard disappeared shortly after the investigation concluded, along with his uncle, Captain Jacques Broussard. Both men vanished into the same underground network that had spirited Celeste to freedom, their knowledge of federal pursuit making them valuable assets in the ongoing war between justice and law. The prison's kitchen was sealed for 6 months, then demolished entirely. Workers who tore down the walls reported finding hidden compartments containing notebooks filled with poison recipes, guard schedules, and detailed maps of escape routes. The evidence was burned without examination, its secrets transforming into smoke that drifted across New Orleans like incense at a funeral for the old order. In Detroit, Ruth Freeman established a boarding house that catered to colored travelers and immigrant families seeking better lives in industrial America. She cooked simple meals with careful attention to seasoning, her hands moving with precision born from years of practice. Guests noted her exceptional skill with herbs and spices, though none suspected the darker knowledge that informed her kitchen craft. She never spoke of Louisiana, never mentioned Orleans Parish Prison, never revealed the 16 deaths that had purchased her freedom. But sometimes, late at night, when November rain drummed against windows, neighbors reported hearing her sing spirituals in a voice that carried the weight of accumulated sorrows and hard-won redemption. The mystery of Celeste Thibodaux officially died in the Ohio River on November 25, 1887. But mysteries, like rivers, have a way of carrying secrets downstream to places where they can surface when least expected. Dr. Webb took his suspicions to the grave in 1903. His final journal entry reading, "Some justice exists outside human law, administered by those who understand that survival sometimes requires becoming the monster they already think you are." Was this the end of Celeste's story, or simply the beginning of something larger, a network of invisible warriors fighting injustice with knowledge disguised as servitude? The truth died with everyone who knew it, leaving only legends that still surface in Detroit's oldest neighborhoods, where locals whisper about a woman who could cook meals that changed lives and settle scores that courts would never address. Even today, some say that in certain Detroit kitchens, you can still smell magnolia and metal. When the wind blows wrong, the lingering scent of justice served at exactly the right temperature. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.